Well, Commissioner, I appreciate you doing this with me, and I'd like to ask you more about the young guy growing up in Auburn, New York, and how that guy ended up in Louisiana and where you are today. But what was it like growing up in upstate New York?
It was a good place. You know, the impression of when you say New York, you think buildings and concrete. But I've told people that that experience was more like you would have in our part of the country now, in the southeast. It was rural. My dad's a welder, union pipe fitter. I have a brother who's 3 years younger than I am. We lived in a handful of mobile homes. I think I was 5 when we bought our first home. We spent one summer living in our garage, believe it or not, when my dad was building our house, and then we built another house, and they still live in that house when I was about 9.
Yeah.
But outside, you know, you learned how to enjoy winter. I played ice hockey for a while, played baseball a lot and basketball. But it was a good place. My extended family was all around, so I had both sets of grandparents nearby and aunts and uncles, and you know, that was my life until my mid-20s when we moved.
Growing up there, did you know you always wanted to be in athletics?
No, I'll tell you that there were two events that I look back that were meaningful to me. One is Syracuse made a Final Four run in '75. People forget a guy named Roy Danforth was the head coach. It was also John Wooden's last Final Four. And I listened to most of that on the radio. You know, it's so different from what we experience now. Those games weren't on TV.
Yeah.
And I think that was probably the first time I ever attached sports and education. And I was 11, and I'd read John Wooden's They Call Me Coach that spring, and I think that was a point of meaning for me. And then I have an uncle who was a basketball coach and a teacher, and I started out in college wanting to be an engineer, and it just didn't work, if you will. Spent a lot of time thinking about the weekend at that point, and decided I wanted to do something that was directly involved working with and building up people. So changed my major. I was going to be a teacher and a coach. That was the grand plan, like my uncle. That looked good. He was coaching JV boys basketball in a place called Phoenix, New York, and I did some of that when I was in college, coached basketball at the high school level.
Well, how did you end up at Northwestern University in Louisiana?
Well, my first job out of college, when I thought I'd teach and coach, I became the intramural director at a place called Utica College, primarily because I was able to go to Syracuse for my master's for free.
Was Larry Costello the coach?
He was. I met Larry there, worked his basketball camps.
We played in that tournament my first year at George Mason.
Won it against
actually,
Utica?
Utica, Seton Hall, P.J. Carlissimo was at, gosh, I can't remember the score. He was at St. Peter's or something like that, and then the other team, but we won that tournament.
Yeah, they had just decided to move from Division I, so Larry was still receiving a paycheck, so you'd see him every month, and then he had basketball camps. So the 2 years I was there, I worked his basketball camps, and you watch the Barry kid at Florida now, and I watched Larry Costello stand at a free throw line with a bunch of kids in the gym and underhanded free throws, and he was in his 60s at the time, nailed 100 of them without missing a beat. When I finished my master's, I had an internship to do. I just sent out, my wife and I had been married 8 months, sent out resumes all over the country, in this place, Northwestern State in Natchitoches, Louisiana, called. And probably looking back, I'm not sure it was the wisest decision, but I knew we had enough money to make it to about December 1st. They offered me an internship, Kathy.
How did you become the golf coach?
Because I walked into the AD's office, I had a nice set of pings. And he had just fired the golf coach. And he said, literally, do you want to coach the golf team? And I said, I had a policy of not saying no. That's how you grow, right?
Yeah.
I didn't make any more money. I was making $500 a month.
Yeah.
So I was an intern, a golf coach, and then they had a really significant infractions problem. And they needed a compliance person, so they then hired me full time. And I jumped from there to a conference office.
I mean, I know the answer is yes, but with a compliance background, that's had to help you every step you've made, from the assistant commissioner, associate commissioner in the Southland to now being the commissioner of our league.
What I learned is, you know, you may not be the most liked person in the athletic department, but you had to build relationships to overcome the difficult circumstances or the no answers. You also had to work with the president, with the faculty, with the provost, everybody had to deal with that compliance role, and that was just an advantage. I had no background. I had bought a rule book in my first job. That was probably my strongest point on my resume, but they had a need, and I was enough of a utility player to step in and fill that need. But those relationships, and knowing presidents, knowing faculty, and having to work with the university leadership, the athletic department leadership, and then coaches, that was probably the biggest asset from that experience.
What about being a runner? I read where you, first of all, I thought you'd be smart enough to run a marathon a month for 15 months. I mean, who would do that?
I don't know. It was, I guess that was my midlife crisis, and I've kidded my wife. It was less expensive than a sports car and less morally problematic than something else that people do when they have midlife crises. But if you actually back up, my wife and I were married in 1988 on a Saturday, and Sunday I ran my first marathon, like the next morning.
I bet she appreciated that.
Yeah, it's a good memory.
Yeah.
Her parents still kind of bring that one up. My brother was in the Navy, and we wanted to do it together. And then my kids actually entered a marathon, like a kids marathon in Birmingham, where you'd run 25 miles and then run the last mile on this big race course, the Mercedes Marathon. And I entered the half, and then said, kind of a switch flipped, and I said, well, I'm going to try another one. And then once I was in shape, I just did it. And the marathon a month was, I'm a probably goal-oriented or challenge-oriented person, is evident there. And once I start down a path, I literally kept running down that path.
What's the last 6 miles like in a marathon?
Well, it varies. For me, you kind of start out the first 10 miles just to get, going. And then from mile 10 to mile 20, I'd kind of turn off my mind and just go, because that's a long way.
It's a long way.
And then the last 6 miles, it's interesting you ask for that. So I would break it up into segments, and I wanted to get to 22. So you wanted to get from 20 to 22. And then once I got to the 23rd mile, I was generally okay. There was one time I ran the New York City Marathon, at mile 23, my legs just kind of stopped.
Yeah.
But once I got to mile 23, I could will myself to the end, no matter what. And but that's the right point. They say 20 miles is the halfway point of the marathon, not 13. And I've found that to be true, because that's where both the work and all a marathon is to me is a chemistry test, like your body chemistry. Will you be able to breathe and function? And then a mental challenge. Can you force yourself to go even though it hurts a little bit?
Yeah. Tell me about how you got interested and involved with India, with the clean wells, the wells there.
Yeah, that goes back. We're part of the Church at Brook Hills, and we had a pastor at the time named David Platt, who was incredibly young and incredibly bright and incredibly passionate. And just through a series of messages, there's a guy in our church that said he should be doing something different with his life. How can you reach people with the message of the gospel and meet their needs, both spiritually and physically, was the mindset. And these two guys started this foundation called Never Thirst that went first to South Sudan and drilled wells with people who, when you would see pictures of what they used for water, and understood primarily the toll on women having to walk and gather water and bring it back. You can't be productive when you're just filling that basic need. And when I first intersected was really personal relationships, understanding the work. And when I turned 50, where it really ramped up is I didn't need gifts, I didn't need to travel. My wife asked me, what do you want for your 50th birthday? And I said, what would be pretty cool is if I could figure out if I have 50 friends who would each give $50. It costs about $2,500 to drill a well, a little bit more. I think that's what I'd like to do for my birthday. So I just kind of took to Twitter and Facebook, and I wasn't the commissioner at the time, so I didn't have the followers. And basically, fundraised and said, do I have 50 friends who'd give $50? And lo and behold, I did. Had a few more than that. Yeah. And it took about 2 weeks. It was really amazing. And so we drilled a well for my 50th birthday.
That's awesome.
Yeah. And then our wedding anniversary was that year, our 25th. And I said, rather than give my wife a ring, I took a chance on this one too. I didn't tell her, or jewelry. why don't I drill a well as my gift to her?
That's awesome.
So there's a well in India with a plaque that says this, our 25th wedding anniversary. And it was actually pretty emotional when she opened it up. I think she knows my gift-giving habits were a little bit more than that, but you know, the ability to affect somebody, and actually about a 50 families, so about 200-300 people that I'll probably never meet, but who have access to fresh water, and it's built by a small church. It's a pretty neat concept that they've really operationalized now in South Sudan, India, Nepal, and Cambodia at this point.
That's awesome. Best book you've ever read?
Probably one that just affected the direction of my life. I'm going to give you a couple. There's three, if you'll permit me. I'm the commissioner, right?
You heard the commissioner.
The John Wooden book, I actually have the copy of They Call Me Coach that I earned in a contest in 1975. It sits in my office, and I've probably read that 2 or 3 dozen times. And actually when I was had a couple of dating relationships, at some point I'd say, hey, there's this book that really impacted me, and my wife's the only one that ever read it. I think the rest of them were scared off. Then in the mid-90s, I was commissioner of the Southland Conference, and I just wasn't living well. And I encountered a book by a guy named John Ortberg. He's the senior pastor at Menlo Park Presbyterian Church. And I happened to walk by. It's called The Life You've Always Wanted. And you know, who wouldn't want to read about the life you've always wanted? And it really said some very profound things, one of which for me was that balance in life is an insufficient goal to pursue. And that's a paraphrase, but I'd been trying to balance like home and work, and I'm about more than that. And then it became about principles and priorities. And then this year, probably the most impactful book was a book called Leading by Sir Alex Ferguson. He was the manager of Manchester United. And you know, I've read books about coaches and athletics, and it's interesting to see the characteristics that make up people that succeed, like yourself, in coaching. They're all a little bit different, but their expectations, their focus, the honesty about how hard it is. That's what fans probably don't understand is the margins are so thin. And this was like a 400-page book about a leadership biography that I found really impactful.
Last question would be, you know, you succeeded Mike Slive, who you were with for a long time, and I'm sure was a great mentor. What's been the biggest difference going from one chair to the other?
Yeah. The biggest difference or adjustment is it just never stops. It never stops. It is a relentless role, and in fact, that book by Sir Alex Ferguson, he said, after a year or two at this very high-level soccer program, he found himself living with anxiety, and he realized, well, that's what they're paying me to do, to worry and think and always be on duty. And so that's really the biggest adjustment. And I had seen that with Mike, but until you live it, and you share that experience, you don't really comprehend it. So I would say that that's the biggest adjustment, biggest difference is just understanding that 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. And the funniest example is I went to Ireland last year. Needed to get away. And my wife and I toured a castle. We walk out and there's 4 fans in purple and gold walking at us. And you can just see there's a moment where they realize, hey, that's the commissioner of the Southeastern Conference. So we had a nice 5-minute chat with them. One of them was from Chattanooga. But that probably defines that reality well.
Well, thanks for coming to Knoxville. Appreciate
Absolutely.
you.
Good to be here.
Thank you.